Hey everyone, welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. In the Mobile User Acquisition Show, we talk about how to use mobile user acquisition strategies to grow your app quickly and capital efficiently. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is presented by me, Shamant Rao, mobile growth leader and founder and CEO of the mobile growth consulting firm Rocketship HQ. Each episode includes strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition that you can use to unlock tremendous growth for your app in a sustainable and capital efficient manner. Our guest today is Anish Shah. Anish is the founder and CEO of Bring Ruckus, a firm focused on attracting, vetting, and recruiting the best talented growth. Today's episode is one that is very, very significant to me. Yes, in the light of what's going on in the world today, where Black, Latino, and underrepresented folks in America have vocalized their frustrations against very structural racism in American society, certainly it is timely. And this is also a very personally significant episode because I've had some personal acquaintance with this sort of systemic racism in America. And without going into too much detail, I'll just say some of these jeopardized my home, livelihood, and career in ways that at the time seemed irreparable. For these reasons, everything that is happening in America today has been very much on my mind, as is the most important question. What do we do about it all? I'm very glad to have today on the show Anish, who has thought clearly about racial bias and the subtle forms it takes. From his perspective of having seen hundreds of executive hiring decisions from up close. For folks who are asking themselves, how did we get here? And how does this sort of systemic racism play out in the relatively white collar surroundings that most of us are in our companies? Just as important, what can we do about this sort of systemic racism in our own companies and professional communities to remove some of the structural aspects that are exacerbated by what's happening in society today? Perhaps this episode will provide some answers and questions for you to think about. I'm very excited to welcome Anish again to the Mobile User Acquisition Show.
Yeah, it's amazing to be back. Thanks so much, Aman.
Indeed. I think much like I said the last time we spoke, I've always learned so much and, just seen things from a different perspective every time I've spoken with you. And this is definitely something I'm excited for today as well. In particular, when we chatted yesterday, you really suggested what, the direction in which it would make sense to take this conversation. And that is definitely a direction that is very near and dear to my heart, as I could tell is to yours. And that is, how dramatically the world has changed just in the last week or so. Tell us a bit more about the situation in which we are recording this for those folks who might listen to it perhaps a few weeks or months down the line.
Yeah, of course. I mean, as a whole, you're seeing mostly Black and Latin communities empower, speak, really say everything that's been on their mind, and really show a lot of the systemic racism. And, we've seen it with the police more recently, but as a lot of people are feeling more empowered, they're speaking out against systemic racism in many other areas beyond just relationships with the legal system or the police system. And I think a lot of the systemic issues are in tech and are in general processes for hiring and, relate to a lot of overall systems that are in place that leave out, Black and Latin people at the top of the pyramid. So therefore, how do you get to that top of the pyramid? You need someone to help you along the way. And there just hasn't been that sort of rope and that hand that's been put out there to help a lot of these people grow in their careers, so they can then help kind of the next generation want to grow in their careers. So a lot of things are happening right now. They're all very emotionally charged. A lot of people, and I think that's very good for the world, because people are feeling a little bit less afraid to speak up and speak out, talk about their situations, for fear of repercussion. And I think that's powerful and necessary around the world. I see a lot of areas within what we do on a regular basis, in terms of hiring senior level folks within some of the most popular companies, and seeing a lot of folks being left out of those conversations within companies that we deal with for whatever reasons, of them not fitting in based on maybe their background, maybe their socioeconomic kind of upbringing, just not sort of fitting the quote unquote mold. And so it's important to discuss those issues. And I think until you discuss them, the people behind the scenes who are making those decisions may not even realize the damage they're doing or the biases they have. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about all of this.
In your own recruiting work, what are some of the ways in which this bias becomes evident to you when you, let's just say, work with a company that is looking to hire a senior level exec or a leader or a growth professional? What are there specific patterns or ways that you see are somewhat common in which all of this manifests?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to back up a little bit, I think it helps give some context about my background, what I do, and how it sort of leads into this conversation. Is actually helping to lead growth and kind of performance marketing for different companies as a consultant and full time for quite a few years. And then I actually just got a lot more excited about the recruiting side of growth, where some of my clients I'd worked with, I just noticed that they had multiple holes within their team, where maybe they didn't hire well enough, or they just needed help hiring. So I kind of jumped in to help them on the hiring side as well as the growth side. And then over time, just felt like the hiring and recruiting side was a little bit more interesting than actually doing the growth. And I built a firm focused on just the recruiting side of the business. So now I run an executive recruiting firm. We're about 9 people, and we basically hire for fast growing startups within growth, marketing, analytics, design, and product. And given that we work with mostly startups, these are companies that are hiring, maybe 1 to 5 people at any given time, not sort of like the Googles and Facebooks, who are hiring, maybe 1,000 people or more a week. And so within that, you see each founder kind of scrutinizing every person a little bit more deeply than maybe a very large company might. Not to say that they don't scrutinize people very deeply, because Google, of course, puts people through a lot of steps, but you just have fewer people that you're dealing with on a regular basis, and fewer candidates as a whole. And we definitely see it manifest when we have a candidate who sort of fits a lot of the skill set and expertise that a client is looking for, but they just don't sort of talk the talk, or they don't come from the same backgrounds as the founders, or they have an accent that's not Western European, and you see that come up down the road as that particular candidate is being evaluated and is quote unquote not a culture fit, and which is some level of codified language. And then you circle back to really think about what about them is not a culture fit, and within that process, it's very easy to see why they weren't, and it's not exactly fair why they were sort of left out of these processes. What I've learned from some level of executive hiring that I've been working on for quite a few years is, my biggest theory on what founders look for in hires is themselves. I think everyone who's at the founder level just wants to hire themselves over and over and over again, whatever that might entail. So part of the issue is that the people who are founding these companies and getting venture dollars, they all fit a very unique mold. You know, they're going to be very true by the numbers. They're going to be skewed heavily much more white and skewed heavily much more male, and they're going to feel a certain comfort within other people who also skew white and skew male, just because culturally they're going to be able to understand each other, speak the same language, and there is just that ease and comfort, right? So I think that's a natural bias between people to want to surround themselves with others who they feel some level of similarity and sort of cultural assimilation with. So, you know, it's so I'm not necessarily pointing the finger and calling them evil, but what I'm saying is that bias is innate, and I think certain people who are in power need to understand that bias a little bit better and be able to harness that and utilize that power they have to step outside of their bias and say, well, hey, no, we're going to bring in some people who don't just look like me, speak like me, and so forth. But then it's also important for the founders and CEOs of these companies to themselves come from much more you know, not very specific white male backgrounds. And that in itself, those people are going to hire a much more diverse group of people working for them. So to make real change within this, the founders themselves need to look a little bit different. How do you do that? You keep going up the food chain. How do you become a founder? Usually a VC gives you money. Well, if that VC is also white and male, they're going to be more comfortable with other people below them who also, you know, fit that mold. As much as, you know, my theory and everyone wants to hire themselves, you know, when you're a VC, you're essentially hiring someone. You're hiring a founder. You're putting your trust in them, and that trust is often going to come from someone who looks like you, speaks like you as well. So, you know, there needs to be more diversity in VC as well, because then that will trickle down to everything else. So, you know, it can be fairly systemic, but, you know, there's a lot of great people out there who are doing work to help a lot of these areas. And I think particularly Black and Latin populations are being left out of really high paying jobs. And I think they particularly get much more bias than any other kind of group, than any other ethnicity, much more than both me and you might get. So something needs to be, you know, done about that as well. How do you approach that? How do you say within an organization, like, we need to make sure these people who are traditionally left out for very poor reasons that they're traditionally left out? I think it is bias, and I think maybe someone might have an accent, someone might not use the quote unquote lingo, may not listen to the same music or go to the same kind of social functions that a founder might see themselves going to. But, you know, it's a question, how do you make this all better? That I think I don't have 100% of the answer to. But I think it starts by the people in charge maybe looking a little bit different. Yeah,
indeed. I think that there's some amount of systemic change that is important and necessary. I am curious, though, again, you've worked with and dealt with a lot of companies. Are there companies and founders that have done a good job of actually overcoming what seems to be a fairly strong bias? And just from the data points that you have seen, what do you think characterizes the people that do overcome this bias? And how might somebody else looking to overcome this bias just learn anything from these folks?
Yeah, I think there's human characteristics that I see within certain founders that we work with that some of them have this capability and other of them don't. I think the ability to take feedback. When I look at some of the founders we work with, I just don't think they have the ability to take feedback. So I don't feel like we have that loop or that relationship. And I don't think anyone below them on their team even has that feedback loop or relationship to tell them, like, hey, you're wrong in this situation, or hey, you could improve by doing this, or hey, I'd really like to see something put in motion that addresses some of my concerns about us not necessarily hiring more diverse. So I think it's just some people are incredibly difficult to get through to. And when you know that you're dealing with someone who is very difficult to get through to, maybe someone who kind of has a little bit more of a frantic personality, or, is just can at times be difficult, you're naturally not going to want to bring up any of these things, right? You don't want to deal with it. You just want to get through your day and move on. And then there's other founders we work with who I think they just are good at listening, and they're good at asking questions, and they're good at asking, how can we do better? What can we do? And then I know at that point, well, hey, I can say things like, well, hey, I looked at your LinkedIn, and hey, I've met a bunch of your team. I've noticed that they all sort of fit a certain profile. Optics really show that maybe there may be a little bit of bias within your process, and it's just something for you to think about. And if you want my help in figuring out how to improve that, and, making it not just, a number on a spreadsheet, you're not just going after like a D&I number on a spreadsheet, but, working to try to improve this, I'm happy to help. But again, I think unless I have trust that that person is open and is the type of person who even wants to deal with that kind of conversation, it's very hard to kind of get that going. And I think that's partially on myself, right? I should probably get over that fact. And even if someone is kind of hard-headed or kind of a difficult personality, give it a shot anyways and see how it goes. So, yeah.
And let's assume this founder says, yes, I just realized, I looked at my team page, everybody looks the same. Oh my God, I never thought about this. Anish, thank you for bringing that up. Help me. What happens next?
I think some people can make the next process a little more complex than it needs to be. I mean, it's just looking at, what's your hiring roadmap? Okay, great. Well, of these people you're looking to hire, let's talk about how we can add a little bit more diversity to your team, and which of these people or all of these people, what are the areas where you're lacking diversity? Is it gender, or is it ethnicity? Is it even, I think the big one that gets left out consistently in tech, which is, I honestly think is frequently even worse than ethnicity and gender, is age. I would say across the board for all of our clients that the age discrimination is much deeper than the other two. So what can we do about it? How open are you to a variety of candidates? And, you never want someone to just hire someone very specifically because they tick a box. But, I think by bringing up a lot of these biases and the fact that someone who doesn't come from your exact background may not fit the exact mold that you originally had in your head. So, when we have these conversations, that particular founder might say, well, hey, maybe this person who comes from a different background, originally maybe, 6 months ago, I wouldn't have thought they were a fit because they don't have just like the Ivy League, the Google, the McKinsey, whatever it else, is like the founder's dream hire. They'll look at the person and give them a chance. And I think that's just kind of where it starts. And it goes from there. And beyond that, I think asking other people who have actual expertise within specifically D&I and how they do it. I personally will say I have not had enough of those conversations to understand from a deep perspective how to do it functionally on a day-to-day basis. I've talked to people who've given broad overviews and why the system needs to change, but I haven't done as much research into like how does that look on a day-to-day basis.
Right. Yeah. And I think those folks need to know and understand that some of this isn't going to come naturally to them, and they need to make an effort, like you said, and they need to just question some of their assumptions. And, I actually can think of one company that actually noticed and said, oh, we don't have too many women on our team. For the next role that we're going to hire, we're just going to interview women. Do you think that is a good idea?
It's a great question. I could see it definitely helping, but it's honestly very complex. Like are you then creating a process just to check a box, or are you legitimately creating a better environment overall? It's a very difficult question. I would take it almost looking at the person who's making that decision and try to gauge what their intent and goal is. But I think the crux of where that starts and the crux of the idea is in the right direction. If that particular decision does lead to a more diverse workforce, again, in any of those areas, age, gender, ethnicity, or even I would look at socioeconomic upbringing. I think it is a good place to get started, or even specifically interviewing more people who fit that kind of mold, because that's kind of like the starting block. And I think once founders just start meeting more and more people who don't fit that very narrow idea of who they should be hiring, there's a lot that can be done there.
Yeah. And something you alluded to earlier was the concept of culture fit, which can often be used as a reason for making a lot of these decisions. Mm-hmm. So would you advocate that founders just abandon the idea of culture fit, approach it differently, define it differently? Again, let's assume some of these startups that you're working with and advising come to you and say, okay, we do want to change. How should we think about culture fit? What is your typical advice to them?
I would just say that it is a part of the process, right? You do want to hire people that you want working for you. And I think we've all met people who we've thought, wow, this person is just amazing. When I think of hiring, I think of it, people hitting 3 buckets to be really well qualified for a job, or that they will come in and do a good job, right? I think it's some level of a mixture of expertise, energy, and attitude, right? So if someone's missing on any of those 3 levels, but the energy and attitude portion is kind of a culture fit thing as well, right? Yeah. If you just get the sense this person can do the job, they have the energy to do it, but they're just going to kind of hate it every day, that's going to spread. So I don't think culture fit needs to go away. It just needs to be bucketed a lot more intelligently, and I think those 3 buckets I gave can offer a pretty good perspective. And obviously expertise is much more technical. I think that's the science of it. So I don't think that's necessarily culture fit oriented, but the next 2, energy and attitude, those are very much culture fit oriented, right? But I think part of it is founders just being educated and talking to people who have been rejected from jobs multiple times because of culture fit oriented issues that are related to, they don't talk the right way, they don't have the same kind of socioeconomic upbringing as the founders. They're just not, quote, one of us. I think as they have more and more conversations with people who have had those experiences, I would hope that they're just going to naturally realize more of their biases and work on improving them. And I think that's kind of the path forward, just hearing more and more people's stories. And then someone who might have an accent that's not, Western European or, traditionally, fitting into the bucket of the bias of what you think the smarter accents are. You can be a little bit more open-minded. And then I think it's actually a hiring advantage at that point. The companies that just keep hiring the exact same people, all the companies are fighting. So one of the things that's very disheartening for my job is, and it really pains me, every company is just trying to hire a very specific type of person. And you know it when you see it. It's like they went to this school, worked at this company, they speak a certain way, they're this age, they're this ethnicity, and that's just like the dream hire for every single company. So then once companies start getting out of that mindset of like, okay, I just need the white guy that, went to Yale and worked at McKinsey, then worked at Google. Then they start seeing like, oh, well, hey, this person who doesn't have that background, who's not being aggressively recruited by every other company, who's incredibly thankful for this job and is going to work, his or her tail off to grow into this job and improve it. Maybe that's someone we look at instead of just being desperate to keep hiring the Ivy League kid who worked at Google and McKinsey.
Yeah. Right. And, there is another side to all of this, which is what happens on the candidates end. As you pointed out, there are candidates who get rejected multiple times for same or similar reasons. And I can see how, as candidates, it's easy to look at all of this as a narrative of disempowerment. Uh, the world is against us. It can be an easy narrative to absorb. What do you recommend for candidates who are in the market for high-paying jobs, who are on paper qualified, even if you sort of well-define culture fit clearly enough, they would be well qualified. What are some of the things you think they can do to maximize their chances?
Well, first off, I follow, like, having that mindset of like the world is against me and is disenfranchising me, and these people are disenfranchising me. There's truth to that, again, if you don't come from this exact sort of mold, and very frequently you're born into the mold, there's nothing you can do throughout your life to fit that mold. Realize don't sort of think that you're being a Debbie Downer. Like, you're being real. Like, if you have certain accents, if you didn't come from a higher socioeconomic background, if you weren't given the opportunities in life that other people were given much more easily and freely than you were, you are going to get knocked. You are going to get dinged. And just realize that those feelings you feel are not wrong. And you yourself are not being sort of like extreme with your feelings. Like, shit's real. When you meet a lot of these founders, like, when I'm pitching these founders and I'm talking to them, like, I know, like, this person isn't someone who's going to accept someone who didn't grow up from the same socioeconomic background, who isn't one of these particular, molded people. Advice I've given to people who don't fit the perfect mold is to look for companies that are run by people who don't fit the perfect mold either, right? Like, if you're looking at your classic, 28-year-old founder, HBS, that's Harvard Business School, MBA, like D2C company founder, which is like, pretty much the template for a founder in New York. They just want other people who are late 20s, early 30s, Ivy League MBA, Ivy League, worked at BCG, McKinsey, something like, they just want that, right? That's, in their mind, there's no chance someone who doesn't fit that mold is as good as them. And again, it goes back to people just wanting to hire themselves, and people who fit that mold aren't going to break out of that mold. And, multiple of those people are our clients, and we help them find those people. And sometimes it pains me when they don't realize that they could be looking a little bit more broadly and intelligently, but they don't. But look for people from non-traditional backgrounds to work for, and you're going to get along with them better. Look for that person who was scrappy and started and bootstrapped their own company. And oftentimes those people might come from more non-traditional backgrounds. Look for people, if, let's say, you're getting aged out of certain roles, look for founders who are a little bit older, or look for companies who already have a history of hiring people who are roughly the same age as you. You already know they're going to be accepting of you, right? And don't focus so much on getting into that hot company, because when you get into that hot company, you might just notice that, the culture isn't where you want it to be. So I would say go on LinkedIn and do research into these companies and look for other ones who already have gotten to the point where they're hiring more creatively, more diverse, and the founders themselves are more diverse.
Yeah. And definitely, I think even though the bias is real, some of the skews are real. Definitely, there are companies, there are founders that are more open, and I think it's definitely helpful for perhaps somebody that's in a minority to really look for those founders that could be more open to hiring folks like them, right? And
absolutely, and maybe be honest with some of these founders. For example, when I was consulting, I consulted for a company that ended up, becoming, I was there really early consulting for them, but they ended up becoming, a $3 billion valuation company. But, and the culture was actually phenomenal. Everyone treated me incredibly well. The culture was phenomenal, but, there was roughly 25 people in the company at the time. I was the only non-white person, except for, I believe it was the admin assistant who was Asian. And so I was just like, I don't want to be the fucking only white person here.
Mhm.
Like, I had an opportunity to join them full time. Maybe I should have, but that's actually feedback that particular company, I think they would have taken that feedback very positively. It was the kind of people who are really good at dealing with feedback loops. So I don't necessarily, look at them in anger or irritation. I just think nobody gave them that feedback loop. And I wish I had at that point, because I think they would have looked around and thought, oh, okay, well, maybe we can get better. And then also realize you're losing an employee at that point. Like, you're seeing the repercussions of it. So, I think one thing people can do is, as they're choosing to not work for a company, specifically give the feedback that I chose not to work for your company because you are not diverse. And I don't want to work with just people who look like this, because I personally will not fit in. And even if you are someone who does fit in, and that's a reason you chose not to choose to work for a company, give that feedback to the founder. Let them know specifically they lost someone great because they are incapable of looking outside their tunnel vision. And that feedback loop, I think, can be really helpful. Also, VCs can specifically say, and obviously this doesn't happen very much. There's so few VCs who will do this, but that, they can specifically say, hey, we're not really funding a company that just looks like this. We funded 15 other companies that look like this. We're bored. Like, we're fucking bored of, you.
Yeah.
We've gotten 10 pitches from literally some fucking version of you this week. Like, we don't need 11. Like, go do something, go diversify your team, go do something creative, but bring something a little bit more creative to the table, bring a more creative founding team, do more.
Yeah, definitely. I think those can be powerful ways to push back. Also, because if you're giving feedback as a candidate, you have nothing to lose. Once you're within the company, there's always a fear that there's a power dynamic at play. But as a candidate, you are in a position of a lot of power, because you're essentially leaving them right there. Right. So I think that's a good place to leave that feedback, because I imagine at least it's possible that somebody on that team is going to perk up and say, okay, something's off here.
Yeah, and enough voices on the team say that, maybe the founder will listen. And I would say another thing that you could do, and I think this is true of anything you're trying to do in your career, the number one thing I think that's going to help you grow your career is networking. So, reach out to people who are part of your community, your ethnic community, your community of whatever your career expertise is, whatever it is. And as you start having conversations with these people and letting them know that you feel like some of the biases have gotten in the way of your career, I think the more networked people that you meet will say, well, hey, I know this company who I think actually would like you, and you're not going to deal with this same situation again. And more and more conversations you have, the more and more networking you do, you're just going to, hopefully come across more of these people who will connect you with companies who are a little bit more creative and who are, going to look at your background and give it a lot more weight.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I think this ties into something you said on the last conversation. It was more in the context of founders, but you said, look, it makes sense for a founder to put themselves out even when they're not looking to hire. And it's the same thing for candidates, right? So if they're putting themselves out there, networking, connecting with peer groups, perhaps from their own minority group or even the broad professional groups, they know they are in the know, they know what's happening. So when there is an opportunity that does arise, they are ready and open and available for it. And at least, again, when people ask me for advice, this is definitely something I do tell them fairly often, which is that, you need to network years before you're even looking for a change, because that's when the opportunities are going to be ready.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And obviously you've done a great job of that, right? Look at all these guests you have on your show, and, look at the business you've built, and a lot of that we've talked about where business comes from, right? And I think you've mentioned more of it comes from, one-to-one personal relationships than anywhere. And that's what I've noticed as well.
It's been, as always, very instructive to me and very thought-provoking. This is perhaps a good place for us to start to wrap up. I know you gave us a little bit of background about yourself, and I'll introduce you. can you tell our listeners how they can find out more about you, where they can go on the interwebs?
Absolutely. So it's bringruckus.com. And you'll see the clients we've worked with, the members of our team, and so forth. And my email address is just Anish, ANISH, at bringruckus.com. Reach out to me for anything, and anything related to this chat, or even just anything to do with talent, hiring, otherwise.
Absolutely, Anish. And we'll link to all of that in the show notes and the transcript. For now, I think it's a good place to wrap. Thank you again for being on the Mobile User Acquisition Show.
Well, thank you as well. Thanks for inviting me for a guest the second time around. And yeah, I think you nailed it. Any conversation with you is always going to be amazing. So thanks so much.
Cool.
For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog. Thank you.